You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof, the smoking gun. It could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property under laws they had no part in making.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Ansel.
This is episode 408 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast, and I have Will Porter returning to the show. Everybody knows Will. He's been the guest on the show 50-something times. Of course, most recently, episode 400, where I think we put together a really awesome show for everyone. So go back and check that out. But here today, I have him on talking about Syria. And Will, how you doing?
Hey, good. Thanks for having me back on, Kyle. How you doing?
Pretty good. I guess I should mention, since it's probably a little bit more important than just being a frequent guest on Foreign Policy Focus, Will is also a staff writer at RT and has published articles at Consortium News, Antiwar.com, the Libertarian Institute, and has a huge archive over at the Daily Sheeple. So, Will, I'm not quite sure how many of your articles we're actually going to be covering today, but I know that you've had some time and you've really been digging into Syria. And when Will digs into something, he really goes deep and gets a lot of good facts. And so I want to ask you, about this whole thing we have going on in northeastern Syria here. What you think is going on, and how the media is covering it wrong, because obviously they are. Starting off here, Will, I want to go back to the time when America first started arming the Kurds. I think that's, one mistake that just about every commentator seems to make is that, they're saying that, oh, this is all Donald Trump's fault. But actually the arming of the Kurds starts under Barack Obama. So bring us back to that time.
Yeah, sure. So, just before we get into some of the more current events with this whole the situation in northern Syria and the Turkish invasion and stuff, I think it's useful to get into some of the background that the corporate press often just leaves out. They just pretend like this stuff isn't important or it's not relevant. It's ancient history. And they do basically what this great political economist named Robert Higgs calls truncating the antecedent, which is just acting like history began last week. They never explain how certain bad decisions in the past lead to bad outcomes in the present. They never make those kind of connections or explain, how things move from here to there. So I think your audience probably pretty much knows the basics of this story in Syria right now. The Turks invaded a week and a half ago. Our great NATO ally launched this invasion against the Kurdish fighters in the north. And, they're trying to set up a safe zone, doing all this stuff. So we'll get into more of the details in a bit of the actual conflict. But the media has gone completely nuts over this, particularly, focusing on Trump and criticizing him for not, telling the Turks to stand down, and that, he's abandoned our Kurdish allies. So I think before we get into that stuff, it's good just to give some context for, how the U.S. got in bed with the Kurds in the first place. So the Pentagon had been dealing with the Kurds for quite some time in Syria by the time they started arming them. But I think the first official confirmation that we were sending arms to Kurdish militias came in the spring of 2017. And like I said, there was a lot of, coordination with them prior to this, but that was the beginning of the, relationship officially arming them. And the decision to start arming the Kurds was actually a result of the Pentagon's total failure in training and arming up a Sunni Arab anti-ISIS fighting force in the years prior. And so the CIA had its own arm and train program called Timber Sycamore, which mostly gave weapons to Syrian rebels opposing the Syrian regime of Bashar al-Assad. But then the Defense Department also had set up its own similar scheme, but to fight ISIS. And as I said, it completely failed. They can only ever find a couple dozen so-called moderate Arab rebels to train. And eventually you even had reports of the CIA's rebels were shooting at the Pentagon's rebels. It was just a huge mess. They couldn't keep it straight. So it was in the wake of that failure, of that failed policy to once it became undeniable, there was no moderate, democratically minded Sunni fighting force. That was when they turned to the Kurdish militias, mostly the YPG, which is the People's Protection Units. And that's the armed faction of a Syrian Kurdish political party. And the U.S. was hesitant to start backing the Kurds right off the bat. They didn't do that right away. They went for the Arabs first. Because they've always known that Turkey would interpret the move to back them in the most dire terms. Turkey has had issues with its own Kurdish separatist movement within Turkey for decades, and Turkey associates that movement with terrorism. And so whether that's right or wrong, that is Turkey's position, and they've been pretty loud about it. And so the U.S. was hesitant right off the bat to back the Kurds. I also think Washington was kind of hesitant to get tied up in the Kurds' own, like, their own aspirations to statehood. They want to have their own nation state and sort of their own internal struggle within Syria for political autonomy. You know, there's just a lot of like baggage and complication that comes with that. However, a little later on in the war, they did do that. They did eventually start backing them. And the Kurds did work out as sort of an effective force against the Islamic State. I mean, U.S. air power definitely helped them, but they also just have a reputation for being good fighters. And so, you know, it did sort of work in pushing ISIS out of a lot of these towns and out of a lot of this territory. But now, as the war in Syria is winding down and like it's sort of, you know, can't go on much longer. There's only Idlib left, really. We're starting to see the fallout of this decision to empower these Kurdish militias as much as the U.S. has. And I just think that's a very important piece of context behind the whole Turkish invasion to see what's led to this situation. At some point, it was very clear. I think we've talked about it on the show. A lot of observers talked about it. It was very clear that the Kurds needed to try to find some way to like pivot back to the Syrian government, because the U.S. could not protect them from Turkey forever. You know, how long can we occupy Syria to protect these proxies? And now, of course, these Kurdish proxies need protection from the Turks that they didn't really need before, because Turkey now says they won't tolerate these heavily armed Kurdish factions holding all this new territory they've taken with, you know, Washington's help. And some of that territory, we should point out, too, is not Kurdish. You know, the Kurds are ruling a lot of Arab towns right now, beyond historically Kurdish areas of the country. And, you know, there's valuable energy and agricultural resources in this part of the country that they're holding. And even if the Arabs in those Arab towns prefer Kurdish rule over the Islamic State, of course, it's not a hard decision. Still, I'm just trying to explain that some of the situation is not really tenable, including some of the territory the Kurds are holding. And so, you know, it became very clear a long time ago the Kurds should have pivoted, you know, over to the Syrian government. And I think they actually tried to do that last year, but the U.S. just wouldn't allow it. You know, they kept telling the Kurds that, you know, we'll handle the Turks and you just don't worry about it. But clearly that didn't work out. So just to summarize this little piece of background or context, the United States basically blew up this unsustainable bubble, like in the sense of like an economic bubble, but in the sense of the power of the Kurds. And now the Kurds can't maintain that power on their own. You know, their increased strength has become intolerable to the Turks, but it's still not enough to really oppose the Turks. So it's like this American support has really landed them into some trouble in their region. And it's all a result of this previous failed program to arm and train Arab fighters, which itself ended up pouring weapons into the region and actually armed up some of the very same radical Islamic groups that the Kurds would later have to end up fighting with U.S. support. And so I just think some of this was sort of foreseeable, if not inevitable, some of this outcome. You know, just given the reckless U.S. policies and the lack of planning, like I think we could have really seen this coming, and I think we did kind of predict this.
And I just wanted to make sure, did I hear you right saying the first official arms going to the Syrian Kurds were in the spring of 2017?
Yeah, I was surprised by this. I went and looked back and found reports at both like antiwar.com and the alternative media and in like CNN and stuff talking about like it's being reported as this is the first like officially admitted arming of the Kurds. I mean, I'm open to being proven wrong there, but I think that is the date.
Okay. You know, that may be right, because I think before that, the U.S. was arming the quote-unquote Arabs that were in, you know, that area of Syria, but the arms were really going to the Syrian Kurds. And in fact, I think in the past on the show, we've talked about a particular Arab, I guess, general at the time. I believe his last name was Silo. And he said that, yeah, us Arabs were just acting as arms procurement for the Syrian Kurds. And so you may be right that is kind of the first official time. I am seeing at least one report here from October of 2015 that a U.S. airdrop in Syria of weapons to the, you know, what were supposed to be Sunni Arab resistance fighters were actually picked up by the Syrian Kurds. And that was like some 50 tons of weapons.
Yeah, exactly. Because there was this the Kurdish YPG, this militia. They teamed up with some of the smattering of like remaining Arab fighters.
Well, yeah, the U.S. invented the SDF. They put that, you know, kind of coalition together, the Syrian Democratic Forces. But exactly. It was really just the Syrian Kurds is that group.
Right. And there were some token Arabs in that group, and I think for some time they were acting like they were just arming these Arabs of the Free Syrian Army or whatever they were calling them, but actually it ended up being the Arab, like the factions of the SDF, and a lot of this ended up going to the Kurds.
Okay, all right. That all makes a lot more sense to me. Yeah, but the support for these groups, is put in motion, as the Obama policy, and now, I guess kind of one of the things that I've talked about on the show is this from the very beginning, from 2015, when we really started to move towards supporting the Kurds. It seemed like this was an inevitable problem that would come up, that we would eventually have to leave Syria. And Turkey had long threatened that if the U.S. armed and backed the Kurds, that they would go to war for that reason. And so it seemed like, I guess I'm just saying, it never seemed like there was really an alternative than either the U.S. staying forever, or the U.S. or the Kurds would then be put in a bad position with either Turkey or Assad.
Right, exactly. And this is just something I feel like should be addressed, just because I think a lot of the coverage of this whole story, of this Turkish invasion, it just sort of leaves out a lot of this context, that like, as if this wasn't something that was very clearly, like, we could foresee this from years out, as if it's just kind of coming out of the blue that Turkey now suddenly has a problem with these Kurds that are stationed in the north there, that we've armed and helped them maintain all this new territory and stuff. It's not a new thing. It's certainly, it's been long in the making.
Yeah, so maybe let's talk about what's been in the making, Will, and what actually happened here in northeastern Syria. What is now the situation on the ground? Who's controlling what? And kind of how bad of a position are the Syrian Kurds in?
Sure. So yeah, the Turkey's operation, which they've called Operation Peace Spring, it was launched on the 9th of October. And currently there's actually there's like a temporary ceasefire in place, and so that's actually one of the more recent things that's happened, but we'll cover that in more detail in a little bit. Notwithstanding that ceasefire, I can just run down some of like the, situation on the ground, who's holding what. So Turkey right now, I think, mostly controls smaller villages, that somewhere around 30 to 50 of these smaller towns, in the northern Raqqa governorate, which is way in the extreme north of Syria. And they've been working on capturing a couple larger towns along the border, particularly Tal Abyad and Ras Al Ain. And they've sort of been going back and forth with the Kurdish fighters, like trading territory, especially in Ras Al Ain. The Turks at one point straight up declared they had taken the town, but I think that was premature. The Kurds have since retaken and counterattacked and stuff. So those are the two major towns they're working on, Tal Abyad and Ras Al Ain. However, the Turks have also managed to capture a very small 50-kilometer section of the M4 highway, which is a very valuable route for moving troops across that region, that border area. However, the Turks will need to control more of that highway if it's gonna be much use in their actual offensive in like moving troops further into Syria. However, right now, simply having that little chunk of the road does help them kind of split the route between Tal Abyad and Ras Al Ain, and it makes it hard for the Kurds to move their guys around too. So even just holding that little chunk of it sort of puts a damper on some of the movements of the Kurds. And so that's sort of where things stand with Turkey right now. I think they have some small portions of those two major towns along the border. However, the Syrians, they struck a deal with the Kurds on Sunday, and now Syrian troops have also been allowed to quickly move into some of these towns across the northeast. And some of these towns, actually, they haven't been in like official Syrian, soldiers or governance hasn't been there for like 7 or 8 years. So it is kind of a pretty important like landmark thing in this war to see soldiers return to some of these cities, like Ain Issa, Al-Hasaka, Al-Tabqa, Tal Tamr. And now, actually, these bigger border cities, Manbij and Kobani, that we see Syrian troops in now. They also sent reinforcements to the city of Al-Kamishli, though I think they've actually had a small number of troops in that city all along, because the government, I think, actually controlled the border crossing and the airport in that city, like, for the whole time. But nonetheless, there is a larger force of Syrians there now. The Russian military police are recently started doing patrols between the two advancing forces of the Syrians and the Turks. I don't think there've been clashes between those two forces yet, and I think sort of the patrols have been doing their, serving their purpose. But of course, as if the ceasefire falls through and they continue moving and getting closer to each other in closer proximity, it becomes way more likely that there will be clashes between the Syrians and the Turks, which is, that's a frightening prospect because, as we know, Syria is backed by Russia. And, a larger regional conflict between Turkey and Russia involving all these countries. Iran is also involved in Syria to some extent still. So we're looking at possibly a larger conflict if, this doesn't get sorted out. Now, I've seen some conflicting reports about the situation with American soldiers. I've seen reports that the U.S. was blocking the Syrian army from moving into some of these towns. I even saw one report in local Kurdish media that claimed that the U.S. bombed a Syrian convoy, but I think that's actually wrong. I don't think that actually happened. Because you can see, like, definitely the thing about the U.S. blocking their movements. You can see local media reporting with photos and videos where the Syrian troops are arriving in these towns. So clearly the U.S. isn't doing that much to prevent them from entering. Also, there are reports of the U.S. dismantling and taking off and leaving some of these positions. So I don't think those reports are quite right. There may have been an incident, though, where like the U.S. flew some fighter jets and buzzed a Syrian convoy or something. Like that might be the origin of this, but I don't think there have actually been any major confrontations between the U.S. and the Syrians.
I was thinking that the possible origin for that was the U.S. bombed a couple, or at least one of their former positions, one of their bases. And I guess to destroy any weapons and stuff left there. This again is being something that I think is maybe a little bit blown out of proportion. It's possible the U.S. bombed it because it wasn't worth to transport the stuff. I mean, imagine how expensive it is to transport heavy military equipment, in eastern Syria. It's gotta cost a ton of money. Maybe it's, cheaper to fly a plane out there to bomb it. And so, I don't know. I guess that felt like that was a possibility as to the, what came out of that story.
Yeah, certainly. And I know for a fact, I know both that it is standard procedure sometimes when moving something becomes difficult, sensitive equipment or something, that they will destroy it. And I've also seen, particularly with this Syrian withdrawal, which we'll get into in more detail in a little bit, but U.S. officials talking about destroying equipment in this case specifically. So that definitely could have been, the source of some of those reports. But now in terms of the Kurds, the Turks have already clashed with them a lot because they were there. The Kurds were already there in the front lines before the Syrian army was allowed to move in. And so the Turks are mostly flying airstrikes and lobbing in artillery shells from behind. And then they're sending in on the ground their Syrian jihadist rebel proxy guys to do the work, do like the dirty work. And that force is now being called the Syrian National Army. But I was actually looking through photos on Twitter of some of these guys, and you can see them flying the old Free Syrian Army flag with the green stripe on top. So it's like these are the same Free Syrian Army rebel opposition guys who were the great moderates earlier on in the conflict, and now they're like thuggish bandit, head chopping, at least according to the media. Which now I think their descriptions are probably a little more accurate than they used to be when they were calling the same guys moderate rebels.
Right.
So anyway,
I don't know if it's the exact same groups, but it seems to be very similar type groups that were used during, I think it was called Operation Olive Branch, that Turkey ran to take the area of Afrin from the Syrian Kurds, which is an area of the northern Aleppo province along the Syrian and Turkish border. And, they used these kind of fighters and they committed war crimes there. That time it wasn't covered by the media, I guess, because no U.S. troops had to withdraw from Afrin to make it possible.
Yeah. And I get the same idea that it is like the same kind of mercenary Syrian forces that the Turks are using. And yeah, I guess we haven't mentioned this. The Turks have launched two major operations in northern Syria before, west of the Euphrates. There was Operation Olive Branch and Operation Euphrates Shield. So the Turks have been involved, in an armed, in an armed way in Syria before. This isn't their first rodeo in that regard. But just getting back to some of the basic facts of the situation on the ground. Since Turkey launched this operation on the 9th of October, according to the United Nations, there's 160,000 displaced people. And I think that's out of like 800,000 that live in the area of the Turkish operation. So a very, significant proportion of people have been displaced in this area, more so than we've seen in years in Syria, in fact. A lot of that, major displacement stuff happened several years ago, and it hasn't been as bad lately. But this is like a, pretty bad flare up. And then in terms of the casualties, according to the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, who, they can be dodgy and kind of pro-opposition sometimes, but I generally trust some of their casualty figures. They put it at 350 total combatant casualties, and that's split evenly between the Kurds and Turkey, and then 70 civilian casualties, which is probably a little more by now.
Yeah, well, thank you for bringing me those numbers, because I have been hesitant to talk numbers and even those kind of positions on the show, just because it's been so hard to confirm everything. Everything you read is either from Syrian media, Turkish media, or Kurdish media, and they all have their pretty strong biases. And so It seems like unless it's against interest, sometimes, you get some good reporting from like aid groups as far as what's going on. But Doctors Without Borders, I know, withdrew from the area. The Syrian Observatory for Human Rights has its problems, but it sometimes provides with some of the better information. I guess at this point, that's not saying a whole lot, but it is what it is. So, take, the numbers that we give you as, they're probably around that, to understand the scale, but it's not, an exact or a perfect count, which it never is in any of these wars.
Right, and one thing I'll say too about like determining like the positions of where, who holds what, like that stuff does change quickly. They can, there's a lot of these really small towns and villages in close proximity, so it's easy to move from one to another. However, I got a lot of my data from social media, like looking at photos of someone who's living in the area, also journalists and stuff. There's all kinds of different people who would be commenting, but I tried to rely on stuff where it's like, here's a photo of the Syrians rolling into Kobani, or, like where they had some evidence of it. It wasn't just some weird blog claiming it somewhere.
Right. Well, it seems like you are maybe doing some more thorough research than our ABC News. I thought, Will, as a journalist, I would give you a second to comment on that because this is one of the more outrageous things that I've seen.
Yeah. So I think you did cover this a little bit on the show already, but I'll just to rehash it or to refresh your listeners. So ABC ran this segment saying how, the way they framed it up very, dramatically, saying, oh, here's the Turkish army firing on civilians in northern Syria. And, they showed a video of a gun show in Kentucky, though. And it's just like, how I don't know, you have to work at that level of incompetence. Like, how could you not accidentally figure out that, like, I don't know, you'd have to do no effort, I guess. It'd either take some very willful deception, I think, or just doing zero research whatsoever. Either way, neither of those are very good descriptions of, like, the news media. The news media should not be, falling for that kind of thing. It's insane. I wonder if someone just sent it to them. Maybe you said this, Kyle. I forget who suggested this, but like maybe a 4chan prank, one of these trolls like sent them pretending to be some kind of expert from the, whatever CSIS, whatever institute, saying, look at this footage I found in my open source research into Syria. Like, I just wonder how it came to be that they got that footage and did so little work, so little due diligence that they could run it as a segment and have to retract it. It's outrageous.
Right. Well, and the other thing is, I guess, is I thought it was really revealing as to who these people are that are commenting and making these bold statements like the U.S. betrayed the Kurds and what the U.S. is doing is the most terrible thing ever to happen. Because somebody like you, who's paid attention to Syria all along, can look at videos and different things on social media and clearly identify, or at least, be able to tell that this isn't the Turkish bombing of a town. I mean, that was obvious to me as soon as I looked at it. The only thing that I thought it could be, other than a bunch of people just setting off bombs, because it looked kind of like odd explosions, definitely not like kind of you see with the military, is that like maybe some kind of plant, like chemical plant or an oil facility was blowing up.
Right. Like with this video in particular, it should have raised some red flags. Like as a journalist looking at this, immediately my first thing is like, okay, how do we know? Like, what are we looking at here? How do we know that we're looking at this? Like even when I'm looking on social media and stuff to try to see troop movements and stuff, I do try to look for like, street signs, things that might, like there was an image of Kobani, in fact, that actually had the town like sign there. Like you can see, that it is Kobani indeed. And there's a lot of things to be careful about, dates of pictures, sometimes old photos resurface and stuff. So you do have to be very careful. But in the case of this ABC video, it was not even like, it wasn't even that complicated. It was just a matter of like, okay, well, how do we even know what we're looking at here? The very first like layer of like diligence you should have done to check that should have revealed to you that, I don't know, should have at least raised some red flags to where you wouldn't have run it as a segment so quickly. Who is in charge of this? Who's actually supposed to be figuring this out?
Right. Well, it would be one thing to get it wrong and say that it was actually video of the bombing of Manbij, and you were like, oh my God, the Turkey is bombing Kobani. Like, okay, people, I mean, that's a mistake that could be made. But it's not even the bombing of a city. There's clearly not the outline of any kind of buildings when these explosions are going off. I'm looking for structures or anything in the background to suggest that this is the bombing of a city, and there's nothing at all. If anything, it would like be the bombing of a farm outside of a town. Like some poor guy's losing his crops, but that's not the slaughter of a town.
And I kind of forget now too, like exactly how the footage looked. Like I'd have to go back and watch it again. But as I recall, it looked very odd. It's like as if there was like a firing squad of dudes with like rocket launchers all standing in a straight line. Like what is this supposed to be? Is this a battle? Who are they shooting at? Like you're saying, what am I looking at here? And apparently no one at ABC even asked this. Or much worse, they did ask this and then just like whatever, effed off and didn't care about the answer they got, and they still ran it as a segment to tell. Like this is very I don't know. It's kind of dark, like the way that this kind of thing influences people. Someone who just saw that segment but didn't see the retraction, which is very common for them to see the first initial error but not to see the retraction later, the quiet retraction. That this affects somebody, that person might have watched that segment and now their views have changed because they're like, wow, that looks like violence. That looks like there's some real, people could be getting hurt there, and now my mind has changed. But really, it turns out they just showed you some nothingness. Like, I don't know. I think that's serious when you're. I don't want to use terms like brainwashing or something, but you're kind of doing that.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I guess the last thing I will add is I think it just goes to show why, they could latch so quickly onto these emotional stories. And that's because why, like Will Porter, if you're like anywhere around that, you see that video and you tell somebody like, hey, that doesn't look right. That means they have nobody in the production process that could do that. So when they go on these ridiculous things and have these ridiculous points, I guess that's why, is because they have nobody to like raise any red flags or say, hey, boss, this may not be a good one.
Right. Yeah, and who knows? There's all these dynamics. Maybe someone, some lowly staffer there did notice, but they're just, they don't want to speak up.
Yeah, it'd be a real shame if that were the case. On the like, to get back to what's going on here, one thing that I've had trouble pinning down exactly is how many troops are leaving Syria. And I guess one thing we could look at is that this definitely isn't a complete withdrawal of Syria, right? Like as far as the whole country goes, because there's definitely going to be the Al-Tanaf base still. No, I haven't seen any reporting to suggest that thing is going to be taken. Is that what you've seen too, Will?
Yeah, that's exactly what I've seen. That like, there's a lot of other things that I'm not totally sure about, but what seems very clear is that they are leaving 150 or 200 or 250 soldiers at this Al-Tanf base in the south, where they're embedded with this group, the Commandos of the Revolution or something. I think that's the name of the guys we backed down there. So yeah, I have read some reports though that the 1,000 or so or 800 or however many are in the north. It's kind of been murky, especially under Trump. Getting troop numbers and stuff isn't always easy. It seems more opaque. But I think I read that those guys in the north, the Americans stationed in the north of Syria, would go to Iraq for now, or would leave the country for somewhere else in the Middle East nearby. And so obviously it wouldn't be all that hard to move them back in, even if they do move next door to Iraq. But overall, I think this is a good thing for, if you're a non-interventionist. Like, I think the fewer U.S. troops that are in the theater and the greater distance between the theater and the soldiers, I think the better. Even if I think the pullout, this could have been managed a lot more smoothly, as we were sort of referring to earlier, by allowing the Kurds to pivot to the Syrian government long ago. They could have saved a lot of trouble and maybe even some lives by doing that. But nonetheless, like, you can't really do much about it now. Of course, I don't get to dictate the terms of the pullout. And so I guess, I kind of just have to take this as a sort of positive development of, if indeed, because we don't even know for a fact where these soldiers are going or how far away from Syria they'll be. I didn't get the impression, based on the reports I'm reading, that they're going home. It seems as if they'll be restationed somewhere else fairly nearby. Yeah. I mean, just excuse me, I lost my train of thought there.
No, I mean, I think you pretty much tackled the whole point there, that we don't know exactly how many troops are still in Syria, how many troops are actually leaving Syria. But one thing that seems like pretty certain at this point is that Trump's not bringing these guys home.
Right. And I remember what I was trying to get to. So the Trump's decision here, I think might have something to do with his campaigning, because like he is campaigning right now. He's running for re-election. And we've been seeing him reclaiming some of this like 2016 campaign rhetoric and these campaign positions. He's being more assertive about them now, it seems. He's been making a slogan out of the whole end the endless wars thing. And it seems like that has really coincided with this attempt to withdraw from Syria. Of course, it's great to hear him say endless wars, but it's very frustrating given that, more than anyone else on planet Earth, President Trump is the guy who can make something happen there. but he's talking about it like it's pollution or something, like it's some amorphous thing that he has no direct control over, institutional, legal power over. But yeah, I wonder if some of that, political consideration is sort of driving events here. A couple of things I've speculated is that the leaving the troops at the Tanf base in the south of Syria, I think that might have something to do with his reelection campaign, because I think maybe he wants to take credit for withdrawing troops, but doesn't want to risk, withdrawing completely and, coming under fire for being like, what they said against Obama, that if you ever leave somewhere, anything bad that happens there is always your fault for leaving. I've also wondered too, if the withdrawal itself had anything to do with the Turkish shell that nearly hit an American position near Kobani there. I wonder if that was the straw that broke the camel's back. Because I think if an American soldier died right now, it'd be a huge deal for his campaign. And I just wonder if that's sort of driven this decision as his re-election campaign. But regardless, I guess
that is one of the most important points, though, right? Is that it's possible that Donald Trump was faced with the choice of American soldiers will die defending the Kurds from Turkey, or the American soldiers will at least withdraw to more southern areas of Syria. I don't know. It's quite possible that was kind of the choice that Donald Trump was making. In that case, if he chose to move the U.S. troops, nobody could fault him at all for it. Now, if it was, the Turkey's going to invade at some point, yeah, maybe he could have negotiated a little bit better deal or something like that, or left in a way that was, made it a more stable transition, whether that meant Assad moving into the territory or Russia moving into the territory. But at the same time, imagine what the reaction would have been if Trump would have entered into 4-party talks with Assad, Putin, and Erdogan, and they all sat down and, as, men tried to figure out how the hell that U.S. troops are going to leave Syria and the Kurds aren't going to be slaughtered, and Assad will be able to regain the territory of that country, and without provoking a war with Turkey. They would have gone absolutely nuts. They would have called him a traitor every single day until he eventually called off the talks, I guess.
Right. Yeah, I didn't even really think about the fallout there for him politically, if he had even tried to do this more formally, and because I also share the criticism that, yeah, he probably could have managed this a little bit better with the Kurds having, Assad or Russia take over. But yeah, that maybe he was blocked on that path in some way, politically at least, for his because he obviously wants to be reelected. And so he's going to try to do whatever he can to, not screw that up.
Right. And I guess I want to condemn the media without making it sound like I'm defending Donald Trump too much, because, for Mr. End the endless wars, he's had 14,000 troops in the Middle East since this spring, or at least during his term. Yeah. So, he's not interested in bringing the troops home. He doesn't ultimately seem interested in ending the endless wars in the Middle East. But in this one case, he may have had his hand forced, or just finally made the decision to at least end one part of one of America's wars.
Right. He did partially the right thing for maybe some of the wrong reasons, I guess you could say.
Right. One thing I did want to ask you while we were talking about troop numbers, and I believe I shared this with you. I don't know if you actually had a chance to listen to it, but Lindsey Graham said on Fox and Friends that one of the reasons the U.S. had to stay, he said, in southern Syria. So we kind of guess that this means Al Tanaf, but who knows? I guess he could be talking about Kabul there on the border, or some other town in Syria east of the Euphrates River, because there's 200 something Israeli soldiers in Syria that need to continue to disrupt Iran's operation trying to bring weapons from Tehran to Beirut.
Yeah, I thought that was kind of a crazy admission. I didn't actually see the clip itself, but I am aware that he said that. And that is usually they're not so blatant about the reasoning for, being in Syria. You and I both have talked about this a lot on this show and elsewhere, that, part of the U.S. interest, or at least part of their narrative, is that they want to stop they want to stop weapon shipments from Iran to Hezbollah in Lebanon. And that apparently they can do this using this road that runs through southern Syria, the Damascus-Baghdad highway. And so sometimes they'll make that sort of argument about, Iranian weapons shipments, but rarely do they just make it directly about Israel and Israeli soldiers. And yeah, the fact of Israeli soldiers being stationed in Syria itself, I don't know if anyone is that the first admission we've heard of that, or I don't know, or at least officially.
That is my impression. I know we had reports, and I believe it was mostly from the Iraqi government, that Israel carried out attacks against the Shia militias in Iraq from bases within Israel. But I was not under the impression that the Israeli government had, said that that's where we carried out the strikes from. Netanyahu did hint that the Israeli government carried out those strikes, but that doesn't mean that they didn't carry them out from Israel. So it seemed to me to be a pretty big omission. And also that, with this, it seems that the mission has now completely changed in Syria. And we are just there to try to disrupt the Iranians and the Russians.
Yeah, what a desperate thing it's been, just to watch how the narrative of this war has changed. First it had to do with backing the moderate rebels against the butcher Assad. And then at some point it kind of split, and it was well, it's Assad, but also ISIS. And then at some point, the third thing came in of, we have to stop these Iranian weapons shipments. And I don't know, now I guess we're just left with that. That's actually the reason. And maybe that was probably the reason all along, really, is the Israeli interest. I certainly don't think it was purely just because we're so humanitarian and so compassionate that we, care about the moderate democratic rebels and we're just misguided or something. I think all along it's probably been something closer to this of, these broader geopolitical things with the Israelis and other interests.
Right. And, just to go down that road one more step, something that Dave Smith has talked about with Donald Trump is that he really exposes people. And I guess that's one interesting thing about Donald Trump maybe making what people see as erratic moves, and maybe they are erratic, but the way that people then have to respond to them, they do reveal the true nature of what the U.S. is doing in the Middle East. And I think that, is somewhat important that when anybody actually pushes the issue just a little bit on this whole emotional defend the Kurds narrative, the real answer behind it is Iran, Iran, Iran. And, I think it's important people hear that, because I don't know if Americans are on board with a bunch of U.S. troops being in Syria if it means that they're there to somehow combat the Iranians. That mission really doesn't make sense to anyone, I don't think.
Yeah, and it certainly has a lot different considerations and optics than, we're just there to protect the Kurds or something. If Americans knew that this was really it wasn't just a humanitarian thing, it was actually this geopolitical thing about Iran, it might change their opinion about the matter.
Will, did you have anything else from Lindsey Graham? I know he's been running his mouth an awful lot, that he's either been doing or saying about Trump's decision to move some troops, in and out of Syria.
Yeah. So I believe it was Lindsey Graham who, I think he's one of the main authors behind the Senate, a bill introduced in the Senate. It's a bipartisan sanctions bill targeting Turkey's military sector and their energy sector. And so Lindsey Graham has been a very vocal opponent of this move in Syria to move U.S. troops to pull them out. And so, yeah, he's even penned a sanctions bill. I forget who the other guy was on the Democrat who did it with him. But yeah, I mean, he's Lindsey Graham is just very he reflects a lot of the broader response in politics and media from both major parties and from really all major media outlets. So I don't know, he's pretty emblematic for this, I guess.
And then there was also a House resolution that I believe just condemned Donald Trump's decision to move the troops.
Yeah, exactly. It was there's a joint House bill to the Senate one. There's a companion bill, but the House one I think doesn't do any sanctions. It just rejects, denounces Trump's move. However, that was it. You'd expect a lot of Democrats to be against this because they all hate Donald Trump. But that House resolution passed by 354 to 60. And so clearly a lot of Republicans also voted for that. So it's not, you do have the higher profile, the usual suspects like Lindsey Graham, Mitch McConnell, and Marco Rubio, who are tweeting about this and, making media appearances about it. But also I think a lot of the lesser known Republicans too are kind of falling in line and revolting against this policy. They're kind of joining the Democrats.
All right. Well, I think the last thing I have on my list here, Will, is the most recent developments, and that is a short-term ceasefire, it seems, has been agreed to between the U.S. and Turkey. And so do you want to give the details on what Pompeo and Pence have been up to in their travels to Turkey?
Yeah, sure. So it was actually just earlier today, we're recording this on Thursday, that Mike Pence and Pompeo, the Vice President and Secretary of State, they went to Turkey to try to convince Erdogan to this brief 120-hour ceasefire, or the Turks are insisting on calling it a pause in operations because they say it's not a ceasefire. We won't agree to a ceasefire, but a pause, okay, maybe. But I'm not really sure what the chances are for this to work, as the Turks have been so insistent about, like, Erdogan said, we will never have a ceasefire before, like earlier this week. He was very vocal and insistent about not doing it. However, I guess in this agreement they've made with Pence and Pompeo, a lot of the Kurds in the north there in that border area are supposed to vacate and leave. And so I guess that is one of the goals that Erdogan had in the first place, was to clear away these Kurdish fighters. So maybe they'll accept that. And I think Turkey's position right now is that, like, as long as you are doing that, as long as the Kurds are actually moving out of this area, then we will agree to this pause. But as soon as it seems to us that it's not happening that way, then we're going to resume. However, another thing to mention though too is the White House also sanctioned Turkey. Like, in addition to the Senate bill, there's also an executive order Trump signed, which seems a little weird. It seems like he is caving to some of this criticism to him. But I get the idea that the sanctions that he imposed on Turkey's steel industry, I get the idea those didn't really have much teeth, and that those probably were not. That's probably not what brought Erdogan to agree to the ceasefire. I'm not sure what I think maybe more the terms of that agreement had more to do with it. That, like, okay, if the Kurds are actually going to move, then they will agree to this. But yeah, so as of now, for the next couple days, I'm not exactly sure when the ceasefire is supposed to end. I don't know when it started exactly on Thursday. But this 120-hour ceasefire, this might put an end to this entirely, but it also could just totally fail and continue. I'm not totally sure what's going to happen from here.
Right, absolutely. Sometimes ceasefires work out really well, and sometimes they go really bad. A couple of reports that I had read was that when Pompeo and Pence were taken off on the plane, the Secretary of the Treasury, Steve Mnuchin, handed them a list of potential sanctions that the U.S. could put on Turkey should they not agree to the ceasefire. So I thought that was interesting. Maybe Trump was going, kind of one of his mafia style shakedown moves, like, hey, this is going to end up really badly for you if you go through with it. And then, of course, I guess I want to talk about the fact that Russia and Putin has a relationship with Turkey. Talked about how they sold Turkey the S-400 missile system, and really how that relationship has been repaired in the years, the early time of Russia's intervention in the Syrian civil war. Turkey shut down a Russian plane. But here now you have Russia selling Turkey an air defense system, and Putin, I'm sure, has some weight that he could exert on Erdogan. It was just a couple days ago that Erdogan said, hey, I'm looking at alternatives for the F-35, which I think most people know means that he's looking at Russian versions of a stealth fighter jet.
Yeah, that is an interesting thing that, like, I've seen some commentators pointing this out too, that Russia is sort of not, they didn't really denounce the Turkish move in the harshest terms. And it seems like they're sort of, they tolerated that for, briefly. Although maybe they kind of knew something that we didn't, in terms of, like, maybe they knew that eventually a deal with the Kurds would be made and that they would be allowed to come in and, retake that area of Syria. However, another interesting thing involving Russia on the, international politics stage is I think earlier this week, Russia linked arms with the U.S. and they blocked a UN Security Council resolution to condemn the Turkish operation. So I think it's a very interesting thing to see the U.S. and Russia sort of aligning in the UN Security Council like that, as often they are at loggerheads. They're usually voting, they're usually at opposing ends. So it's kind of interesting to see how that, worked out. That could just be a one-off thing, but I don't know. It might also signify something for the, future of U.S.-Russian relations.
Well, this is something that we've talked about throughout, our time doing shows together, Will, and just a common thread of the Syrian civil war is that so many times the U.S. and Russia, the stated main objectives, at least, were kind of the same. Yeah. Russia was there to kill the jihadists. The U.S. was there to kill jihadists. Why not work together to kill the jihadists? The Russians, I don't know if they have any, like, particular love for the Kurds, like they're glorified in, at least in kind of American culture, but they worked with the Kurds. They worked with the Kurds in Afrin before, and in fact, it was a somewhat similar situation, I think, where it was Putin's decision not to put his forces between Erdogan's forces and the Syrian Kurds, and that's how Afrin was lost, and so. But at the same time, Russia had worked with the Syrian Kurds in the past. And so, we kind of had common allies in Syria, definitely had common enemies. And here again is a situation where I think it's pretty clear the U.S. and the Russians want the same thing at this point, and that is for Turkey to not take territory in Syria. And hopefully, like you said, this may put them on the same side of a couple things and change the relationship a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. I do hope that it bodes something good for the relationship.
Well, we're about 45 minutes here, so unless you have anything else, I'll go ahead and wrap this thing up.
Yeah, I think we covered pretty much everything here.
All right, everybody. That's Will Porter. Does really great writing over at RT every day of the week. You find him at his Twitter page, WKP ANCAP. Occasionally, he's on the blog at the Libertarian Institute. This week, he has a great one out. He put together a timeline of all the kind of U.S. and Iranian conflicts since Trump took office. And so, all those little dust-ups, the U.S. leaving the JCPOA, easy to read timeline. Will Porter put it together. It's on the blog. Occasionally he writes again, Consortium News, antiwar.com, and has a huge archive at the Daily Sheeple. Will, thanks for coming back on the show.
Thanks, Kyle.